There is growing uncertainty among residents about what will happen to planned service delivery projects that were announced by the ousted DA-led municipality in the city of Johannesburg now that a new mayor has been elected. Last week, Mpho Phalatse was removed as the mayor of the city of Johannesburg through a motion of no confidence, and this also saw her 10 mayoral committee members leaving office. Now, similar scenes have played out in the Nelson Mandela Bay Metro, where the then Executive Mayor Eugene Johnson was removed from her position and replaced by the Democratic Alliance's Retief Odendaal. So to unpack some of these and other developments in politics, we join now in studio by political analyst Ongama Mtimka. Thanks so much for stopping by.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, coalition politics, and this is the buzzword now, coalitions. And there is, of course, a strong sense that come the 2024 elections, we will see more coalitions having to be formed across more municipalities and metros. But what has been your assessment thus far on how we've done as a country in this form?
Sure. Let me start with what I'm excited about first. I think it's great to live in a constitutional democracy, a country in which the rule of law has preeminence over, power centricity in what's happening in councils and stuff. Why? Because the legal political nexus has played out quite nicely, or sometimes in a messy way, in processes of change of government. What's an alternative to that? In countries where the rule of law is not preeminent, it gets to be intimidation, violence, and other things. So I'm excited about that politicians, when they cannot get joy, in the political processes, know that the best recourse is in the courts. So that's important. It helps, it shows the strategic correctness of those who chose a constitutional democracy for South Africa. And by the way, Sakina, it's not uncommon throughout these changes of power in municipalities for one, the affected party to precipitate a legal challenge so that people can stumble and then they can be able to challenge the outcomes in court. We saw that with the Democratic Alliance when Trollope was removed, where attempts were made where a speaker would be absent at the crucial moment. But obviously the other party, knowing how you play the game with the rules, had the benefit of provincial government, could send somebody in. So even in this instance, there are two things that Mpho Phalatse is facing. One, a changed political balance of forces in the Johannesburg City Council, in the Johannesburg City Council. Another, this idea that some procedures were not followed. Now, the interesting thing is the response recently by the ANC that, look, if you win in court, it's not going to change the balance of forces in council. So you'll win in court, you'll get your recourse. But we can exercise the political balance of power in council to vote you out, which is actually the reality of the situation.
But of course, if you're a resident in any of these metros or a municipality where coalitions are finding it very difficult to basically deliver services, where does that leave you? Where does it leave the voting public at large?
Sure. I guess in the short term, it leaves voters with, I think, what we need to do, going back to what was outlined in the Dinokeng scenarios in 2007, this idea that we as residents must begin to take action on matters of service delivery. There are channels for cities to at least engage the administration in making sure that things are done. Now, to the extent that the administration can act devoid of what's happening in council, sometimes you are able to get, for example, connections to electricity, refuse collection, water connections, among other things. However, what I've seen is that the debilitating conflicts at political level in council have actually had the administrations cave in, where you find that the affections within the administration that are aligned to the dynamics that are happening in council, which make it difficult to work. So, which we will see people purging executives, when in fact when there's a change at a level of political leadership, it shouldn't affect the executive. Voters are being forced by some parties, and I think the DA has been big on this, campaigning to say, don't vote for smaller parties, vote for only the big parties. Unfortunately, the South African electorate are at a point where they can no longer trust the big parties and are voting outside of. So when they withdraw the vote from the ANC, they're not automatically giving it to the DA because it's not worth their trust it's not worth their trust at the level that is required in order to give it an outright majority. So politicians should just become mature instead of continuing to blame voters on their behavior in terms of how they choose to vote for parties that are competing. So two things there to go back to your question. One, there's enough room for action for residents at a municipal level. So we need to take that a lot more seriously. We need to participate when municipalities go and undertake public participation processes around budgets, for example, because that's supposed to be ward-based. And we get too busy sometimes to attend those ward-based meetings where plans are being made. So we can take action immediately. And then the second one is we must think a lot more with our voting, but it will not be in the way that the DA envisages, where it's one of the two big parties and no smaller parties.
So you talk about budgeting and, ward-based decisions, and of course the input and the participation of the electorate. But the problem there is, for example, do you know when that is? Has your ward councillor ever alerted you? Has anyone ever put up a poster to say, hey, community, the electorate in Ward 10,
sure,
there is this coming up, so if you're interested, come and join us so we can have a discussion, so that this elected representative actually takes a mandate from their constituency. That doesn't happen.
You're making a valid point. By law, municipalities should advertise when a public participation process for budgeting takes place. In fact, this period, so around August, September, the draft budget for a coming financial year should be started. This public participation process is undertaken. And then around March, April, there should be the final round of public participation in order to approve the final budget of a municipality. You're quite right. The advertising of that doesn't happen in platforms where people can see them and they are quite visible. Why? Because what happens is that political parties prefer mobilized constituencies rather than the average citizen coming into those meetings. So you'll find that the branch knows that there is a public participation process, as opposed to all the residents or as many of the residents as possible.
And all of this is problematic. And just, going back to the coalitions overall and the instability that it causes, you hear people saying that, well, this is in the main about power. It's about access to the coffers of the municipality. And that is what the politicians are concerned about. But when it comes to service delivery, again, the administrators in any given municipality or metro, the politicization of that particular function has also bedeviled this matter. And this is where citizens get stuck, because it's one thing for things to play out in council, but when administratively actually things are not moving, what are we doing and why aren't we rectifying this?
Sure. So let me start with your power-centric, analysis. So, indeed, that's what happens. When I made an argument, and many of us did, when election results were announced and we had more hung councils, to say, in instances where the difference between a would-be coalition and the opposition benches in a council is between 1 to 3 seats, it doesn't make sense to actually constitute a coalition there. And with the executive mayoral approach, what should be explored is a executive committee approach where you could have all the parties represented in council represented in the executive, among the MMCs. In that, you have a ceremonial mayor, not an executive mayor. What that would do is it would take away the power that is assumed to be had by the executive arm of a municipality. I say assumed to be had because in a municipality, there's no separation between executive powers and council. So it's a facade. Now, what they should be doing is to explore that. The ANC in the Eastern Cape tried to do it, but you know what? They tried it when they were losing the municipality, which was my gripe. That how do you, as the province, not do it immediately that your party secured the leadership of Nelson Mandela Bay, because you would facilitate the decision making quicker when you propose an executive committee system. So that's in relation to the power approach. South African politicians have not become mature enough to realize that you need to be humble with political power and collaborate with others. And then with respect to the administration and lack of performance, it's said that many administrators, people who are hard workers, have been forced to accede to the demands of the political elites, because these people assume that being voted by the people is a center of power as opposed to a center of service. And as such, they treat officials who are in senior positions within local municipalities as the lesser of, as opposed to, professionals that should be respected and be accorded space to actually do their work.
So again, this hunger, this thirst for power almost seems to negate what the voters have voiced through casting their ballot. The voters in constituting the outcome as it is are saying something.
Brilliant, absolutely. And that's what our politicians can get. When voters, it's one thing to see an outcome as hung, that is, nobody could win, so there's no zero-sum outcome. It's another to say voters are telling us that the majority of the support is to the ANC and the DA. And therefore, those parties must collaborate and then bring the other ones who've got smaller representation. That's the idea of a proportional representation system. That's why we do not have a first past the post. If we had first past the post, what would happen is that, because you find that in these metros, even though the ANC has got a lesser share of the proportional representation seats, it's got more constituencies. That is, it has got more wards. Now, if we had a first past the post system, we would have, on the basis of the number of wards, the ANC continue to win, to govern, but with less than 50% of the votes. So there was wisdom in choosing proportional representation. And our politicians need to grow up and actually pay homage to the founding mothers and fathers in 1993, 1996, who designed our constitution in the manner that they did.
You said something earlier about humility with power. Now, if you look at what's playing out in the city of Johannesburg and how the DA-led council actually lost that position, they were accused by their coalition partners with the DA of basically being disrespectful and not really listening to the smaller parties in that coalition. And even now, the DA seems, it seems very difficult for them to literally come down a notch and concede that maybe we didn't listen, maybe we didn't treat our coalition partners with the necessary respect or decorum, whatever the case may be. Let's just mull over that for a moment, about that humility.
That's very important, especially, Sakina, considering that Nelson Mandela Bay and City of Joburg have almost followed one another within a period of about a month in terms of change of power. I thought that what happened in Nelson Mandela Bay reflected a DA change of attitude, because they had precisely what is required in Nelson Mandela Bay to take that municipality from the ANC, where the office of the speaker went to somebody else, to another party. The deputy mayor went to another party. And the outcome is such that there is more harmony among the coalition partners, because the attitude to who should get what among the MMC positions was approached with a degree of humility. Whether that has to do with the style of Retief Odendaal, and he's perhaps asserting the local dynamics more in Nelson Mandela Bay, or the party's attitude, it's something to be tested. But the experience in Joburg and the allegations that Mpho Phalatse was marginalized in the discussions suggest that who has got latitude to be able to determine a local feel to the organization of a coalition has got to do with either party political dynamics, because Retief Odendaal has been in that municipality for a long time. He might have had more leverage over the national power bigwigs compared to Mpho Phalatse, who has recently joined local government politics and perhaps may not have had stronger, a stronger voice in the process. I know some people have actually brought in the race dynamic here to say Mpho, this has happened to Mpho because she's black. I don't know to what extent that is true, but there is definitely difference in the DA's national attitude to constituting the government in City of Joburg and Nelson Mandela Bay.
It's going to be an interesting one to watch because Mpho Phalatse seems to not have thrown in the towel. She did take exception, though, to what some have said, was her being strong-armed or marginalized, perhaps, and having to take instruction from the DA's federal executive. But we don't know. We don't know what actually went down there.
Yeah, well, and also I noted that they are supporting her in her quest to get legal recourse from the process. So I think there's a degree to which that may be true.
So we'll see how all of this plays out, because one thing is certain, we seemingly will see a lot more of this as voters become disgruntled, but also try to decentralize power and maybe get a few more decision makers into play. But of course, we're going to talk more about this. Thanks so much for stopping by.
Thanks again.